So today's speaker, we're lucky to have gotten her up here during cold weather, is Andrea Thomaz from Georgia Tech. I'm not going to consume a lot of time, but there are bios out there on the poster and in your email. The important thing to understand about Andrea's work is that it's really cool, and it's both physical and spoken and learning and all sorts of different things. So there's something in here for everybody, although I don't know if it's in this particular talk. So if you don't see it in this talk, go hunt down her papers. Thank you.
Thanks. Great. Well, it's a pleasure to be here, and I'm excited to talk to you a little bit about my lab at Georgia Tech. We call ourselves the Socially Intelligent Machines Lab because we think about, it's brought to you by, all of this work is brought to you by all of my wonderful grad students. And we like to think about human-robot interaction in a general sense. And we're thinking about this from a social intelligence, so we have an AI bent to thinking about human-robot interaction. So we want to think about how to computationally model aspects of human social intelligence and embody these on social robots. So we think this is the way that we're going to get robots that are acting the way people expect them to act and doing the things we want them to do in the world. So that's our general kind of approach. Today I'm going to talk about a specific kind of social intelligence that I've been kind of obsessed with for a few years, and that's learning interactions. So I'm really interested in getting robots that can learn from end users. And the basic reason is that I want to see robots out there in the world, personal robots in people's homes, and people are going to want to teach those robots. Or I think they're going to need to teach those robots because they're going to want those robots to do a task like clean the kitchen. And the thing about a task like clean the kitchen is that it's different in every home slightly, and it's only the user knows what they want. So these are the kinds of tasks that I'm interested in getting robots to do. Are these ones that we're going to have an end user doing some level of programming or personalization of a task after it's been deployed. So if we think about that end user, that person, what I like to focus on is that they may or may not have any experience with machine learning or any knowledge of the underlying algorithm that the robot's using. They may have not interacted with robots very much, but they've got a lifetime of experience with social learning interactions with other people. And so I like to think about how we can try to leverage what people expect out of social learning and learning partners and try to build robot learners that are going to meet those expectations. So that is a field of research that we're calling socially guided machine learning, where we're trying to build algorithms and systems to take advantage of the ways that people naturally approach teaching. So I want to build robot learners that meet your expectation of a social learner. Okay, so we'll call this building computational models of social learning. And so today I want to focus on 4 different projects that kind of touch on 4 different aspects of something we know about human social learning and how we think, one interpretation of how this should influence how you build a robot social learner. So I'll talk about 4 different projects focusing on some things that we know about social learning, that it's an embodied interaction, or it can be a physically embodied interaction. It's people are goal-oriented in their interactions. So how does this play out in a social learning interaction? Human learners are very transparent for the teacher, helping them build a mental model. So how can robots do a little bit more of this? And social learning is embedded in this reciprocal, tightly coupled interaction. So what does that mean for the robot learner? And how should that impact our computational system? So I'm going to just jump right in and start with the first project that is thinking about learning as an embodied process, or learning through physical interactions. And so in the field of learning from demonstration in robotics, this is known as kinesthetic teaching. And there's lots of algorithms and techniques that are out there that expect that kinesthetic teaching, or physically doing the demonstrations of the task, are how the robot's going to be getting its input for the learning problem. And so what I'm interested in is whether or not real people that you bring in off the street and have them teach your robot, if they can actually teach this way, can they provide good demonstrations of skills? And we can potentially offer different sorts of interactions to make it easier for people to provide good demonstrations physically to the robot. So I'm going to talk about some experiments that we did recently on trajectory input versus keyframe input for this kind of learning from demonstration interaction, where trajectory demonstrations are sort of the typical input to a learning from demonstration algorithm, where the state is recorded completely from the start of the demonstration to the end point of the demonstration. And the state is typically some end effector pose over time, or end effector pose with respect to some target object frame. And there's lots of techniques out there that make this kind of assumption on the input. And so if we ask, so we ask people to do this kind of thing, and here's one example of what that might look like. This person is giving a trajectory demonstration of how to close this box. So they're having a lot of trouble with the kinematics of the robot, which is, somewhat of a novelty thing, but even after, this is after practicing with the kinematics of the robot. So this is all being recorded as input to my demonstration. And it just maybe not the most ideal input for your learning algorithm to have this full, sure, it shows you the variance of all the ways that you could get this thing done, but it's maybe not the variance that you were looking for. So an alternative to this might be to just provide keyframe demonstrations or sparse trajectory of sequence of poses that, when connected together, equal the skill. This is used in animation or in factory automation. The difference here is that in animation or factory automation, you're talking about playing back those poses exactly and maybe doing something special about splining in between them. But here we're talking about using this for a learning process where you actually want to model the distribution and variance that you see of those poses. And so that's the difference here in what has been done before. And so here's a person giving the same kind of demonstration with keyframes, and now they're going to say record frame to say record this particular pose. And now this person has the same kind of well, not yet. They take the same kind of process to figure out exactly how they want the skill to be done, but none of that's being recorded. So we don't have to record their exploration of the kinematics of the robot. So he kind of does it completely wrong, and then because people actually need to, with a high degree of freedom robot, they need to move the degrees of freedom kind of one at a time to get it in their configuration that they want, but that's not what the robot necessarily needs to do when executing the skill. So that's kind of why it is an easier thing for people to do. So our intuition is that this is easier for people to do, and we actually had 34 people come in and teach a variety of different skills to the robot using these two different mechanisms. And our hypothesis was that trajectory demos would be less good than these sparse keyframe trajectories. And so I can just give you a overview of what we found, that people were generally positive towards both. So they weren't strongly opposed to giving trajectory demonstrations, and they thought that keyframes were good too. But providing a full error-free trajectory demonstration was hard. So they didn't necessarily dislike it, but from a learning perspective, it wasn't as good of input as the keyframe demonstrations. But the keyframes lose important timing and velocity information that comes up in a lot of skills that you might want to, it's harder to communicate this information. We actually saw that with keyframes, people tried to give a lot of keyframes close together to specify that kind of timing information, but it wasn't interpreted that way. So really what we want to do is let people give keyframe demonstrations for the parts of the skill where that makes sense, and then jump in to give a trajectory demonstration just for the parts of the skill where the velocity or exact positioning really matters. So now with different speech commands, the robot's going to be able to do this. So now we have to think about how we can have an algorithm that can build up a model of the skill using any of these different kinds of input. So we want to be able to learn from a full trajectory, from a sparse trajectory, or some combination of the two. And so the first thing that we've done is this keyframe-based learning from demonstration, where we take any kind of trajectory input. Here I'm just illustrating with a simple drawing letters gesture. So I can draw a P gesture with a single stroke or with keyframes or from some hybrid of the two, and I want to build a model of that. So the first thing we do is cluster all of the, we turn all the trajectories into keyframes, we align all the keyframes and cluster them, and then these distributions of the keyframe poses, the sequential pose distributions, end up being the model of the skill. So we use that as the model of the skill, and then to generate the skill, you sample from each of these distributions and spline between them. So I'll show a demonstration of scooping and pouring, where a lot of the skill is done with keyframes, but then this kind of detailed scoop part is nice to show with the trajectory instead of keyframes. So here's another point where the detailed trajectory is given. So that's an example of kind of a longer skill that would be really hard for people to give these noise-free full trajectories of without splitting it up into different pieces. Okay, so I'm going to give more demonstrations here, but I won't. I'll spare you all the demonstrations and just show the resulting skill with the keyframe, the sequential pose distributions, then sampled and executed. Mostly get it right with a few coffee beans spilled. So we demoed this at the AAAI Learning from Demonstration Challenge in San Francisco, and where the PR2 was teaching food tabletop tasks. And so lots of conference goers got to teach the PR2 with hybrid demonstrations over the 3 days of the conference. So I'll just show one demonstration of this person. And here we saw all the time people playing around with the kinematics of the robot to decide exactly how they want to do the task before recording a frame. And so this video is horrible because of that light, sorry. But one interesting thing we saw people do with the hybrid demonstrations, here he's teaching to pour a bowl of cereal. And so he gets it all positioned and does the keyframe and picks up the cereal bowl. But then before giving the trajectory demonstration, plays with some different ways to give the trajectory portion of the task and then records it. So this hybrid mode of demonstration lets the person kind of explore the space and only record the parts of their exploration that they actually want to pose as input. So they've decided that this overhand way is kind of the best thing to do. Okay, so that sort of gets into the first aspect of our, oh sorry, that's very washed out. So that sort of is the project about physically embodied aspects of the task and how we can have learners that take advantage of their body and the physical interaction in order to be a social learner. So the next sort of aspect of social learning that I wanted to touch on is the focus of learning being goal-oriented. So as opposed to having the robot worry about exactly how to do some skill, the focus could be on learning higher level goals. And so one reason to do this is that we think that a lot of what people are talking about, and we saw this in our previous work with skill learning, when you were actually, even when the state space is something very detailed about the end effector pose, people are thinking about it in terms of the overall state space and the goals of the task. And so, and if we're talking about cleaning up the kitchen and different things, a lot of what you're going to need to teach the robot is about the parameters and goals and objectives of the tasks, not about necessarily the low-level motion details. Those may be able to be solved in other ways. And also, we know that people interpret each other's actions in goal-oriented ways instead of, we have a tendency to focus on goals and intentions, not literal motion trajectories. So, this notion of a learner doing goal inference instead of paying attention to specific motion trajectories, it could be an intuitive way for people to think about learners. And so I already kind of said this. The environment is kind of a common ground between the human and the robot. That's this perceptual common ground that we know that the state representation can be about. And the relation between this goal-oriented learning and the previous project is that one thing that we think people are doing with these keyframes, or how they select what keyframes to give, is that they're really thinking about it in terms of the goal objectives of the task. Like, go here, go here, go here. Well, so there's something about here that you should be modeling as a sub-goal of this task. And so that's how we're starting to think about this. Okay, so I'll just talk about how we represent task goals. We have two things that we model about a task goal. So first we model the criteria, and that's the required properties for an object to be included in this task, and the expectations. So the required properties for an object to be considered completed or fulfilled in this task. So for example, if I'm talking about the task of recycling bottles, then a criteria would be, what are the properties of objects that need to be recycled? And expectations would be, what are the properties of objects of recycled objects? So to complete a task, I would look for all objects that meet the criteria and execute actions in order to have them meet the expectations of the task. For this, we have. So first we have to talk about, when we're talking about tasks and the task environment, I have to talk about the perceptual environment that we're working with. And we have this sensory system that is doing some pre-processing, and then we do some feature extraction, and the belief system takes and creates object-based representations of this feature. So as an example, some of this work was done with Honda, so we have all of these videos are Asimo videos. And so with Asimo, he's looking at the tabletop and would be getting percepts in and then grouping those into bags of features about the different objects on the table. Okay, so the task that we're doing here is setting up the table or cleaning up the table. And the perceptual space that we're talking about is from an overhead camera looking at the location, size, and color variation of the objects on the table. And color variation because low color variation is a clean plate and high color variation is a dirty plate. Or we hope that that's what you would learn from that feature. Okay, so learning proceeds.
All right.
Asimo is kind of cute.
You need to learn how to set up the plates. Sure.
Okay, so I have these tasks that I'm trying to build up, and I'll teach you how to set up the table, and I start a new task, and first you need to set up the plates, so I start a new subtask, and now I expect to see some demonstrations. And the demonstrations are demonstrations of the start and end states of the subtask, and so that is, I take a snapshot at the start, and I take a snapshot at the end, and then I do something to think about the difference between them, and that is how I model the criteria and expectations of the task. The models are not showing up very well. So I'm going to model the changes. So over a few different demonstrations, I would model the criteria and the expectations of this subtask with a multivariate Gaussian mixture model over each of the dimensions of my perceptual space. So I'm looking at what kind of perceptual changes did I see and how much variance did I see over those perceptual changes from the beginning to the end of this task. So if I see, for example, a few more different demonstrations, I see that there's a little bit more variance in where the where the objects can come from, and I have a criteria just for the location variable. The criteria is in this general area, and my expectation is in the other. So if I look across all of my perceptual dimensions, the criteria is that I expect an object of this general size with low color variation in this general location to then be moved to this other location. So
Is there anything to set up?
Yes. You can start this object.
So when I go to execute the task, is there anything to set up? I check this with my criteria model to see, do any objects match my criteria model? So this object matches location, size, and color variation. So I say yes, you can set this object.
How do you set up this object?
In this, you decide by sampling your expectation model and deciding for the particular location that you want to put it. So I need to change that object's location. So the thing that we want to do with this, and the way we think that this is really useful in making the robot more of a human-like learner, is to actually transfer these perceptual concepts for new tasks. So the fact that there might be common environments that I learn different tasks in the same environment. So some of these perceptual concepts might come up again. Or I might have similar goals applied to similar objects. So I'm going to take these perceptual models and say, okay, well, I'm going to call this location 1, I'm going to call that location 2, and that's going to be size 1 and color 1 or something like that. And now I can have objects have their external features, and they also have these derived features of being location 1 true and location 1 false, and so on. So for a particular object, I have its external features and then all of its derived features based on things that I've learned in this task domain. So now this comes up when I want to go and learn a new task, like setting up the cups.
Start like this. And like this. Okay.
So I do the same kind of thing, but now that I see that this is also has these more general features like in location 1 or not location 2, and it moves to not location 1, but also not location 2, then I have a couple of different ways to model this without transferred concepts. I just have my single demonstration like I had before. But with the transferred concepts, now I have a really nice model of, I can more quickly get to a nice model of, cups are found in the same kind of location that plates are. And I can go with this until it's contradicted, basically. That's the rule of thumb that we've been using.
Is there anything to set up?
Yes, you can set this object.
So now it generalizes to a different color cup faster because it is using the plates model on the cups.
Here.
Okay, so quickly, Asimo is not very manipulation. It doesn't do a lot of hand manipulation. So we did the same task on Simon, and so same problem. We're setting up the plates and cups, and so it gets all the place settings, and then transfers that location perceptual feature and the color variation perceptual feature to the task 2, and learns to empty the dirty bowl into the trash through a couple of demonstrations, and learns to empty a dirty cup into the sink through a couple of demonstrations, and then finally to put the dirty bowls and cups into the sink. And so the number of demonstrations that it would need after it gets down to these later tasks, when it's using more of the general concepts as features, is less than the number of demonstrations that it needs in the tasks where it's using the low-level feature space. So here's the final execution of the whole learned skill. So the key point here is that the robot's able to start with this generic low-level feature set, and then as it's learning new tasks in a given domain, it's also building up a higher-level feature set that is applicable to new tasks in this domain, or we hope applicable to the new tasks in this domain. Because things like the location of the shelf and the location of the sink or the location of the trash can probably don't change very much, and so that's something that you should carry with you from one task to the next. And so this is the kind of thing that we think people are going to expect of a learning partner, that they don't have to reteach these sort of similar aspects of a new task in a new environment. So, okay. So the next social learning concept that I want to talk about is transparency. And so this is a very general concept in social learning. So there's lots of different ways that a learning partner or a teacher and learner have transparency going back and forth. And so a teacher, an active teacher or a good teacher, is trying to watch a learner and build a good mental model of their learning process and decide, okay, what's not known, and what information do I need to give next, and how can I be a better teacher? And so this might be implicit things like facial expressions that a teacher is keying into, or very explicit kind of transparency is just asking questions, and we do that all the time as learners. So that's a very tightly coupled and transparent process where the learner is engaged and the learner feels compelled to help the teacher build the right mental model of their learning state. So explicitly asking questions is this really interesting way of expressing transparency. And we've been focusing on this kind of question asking transparency because there is a nice computational analogy in the field of active learning. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the stuff we've done in active learning. And so just to briefly introduce what we mean by active learning. So active learning is a paradigm of machine learning in which the learner chooses its own examples to be labeled, chooses which of many examples it wants to be labeled by the teacher. So traditionally this is that you have a lot of unlabeled examples and a few labeled examples, and maybe I'm building a linear classifier between green and red examples. And so this is the hypothesis that I have right now. And the learner best knows that the learner can select that these examples that are very close to my decision boundary are the ones that would be the most informative for me as a learner. So teacher, if you could give me those labels, that would be great. And so the difference, it's interesting to think about the difference that we come across when you talk about a robot trying to do this kind of active learning process. So we're interested in robots interacting physically and embodied and situated with a partner. And so we don't have a labeled pool of data examples, and we have to synthesize an example that we're going to get a label from the person. And so we are limited by what's in the environment. So if I have a question in my hypothesis space and it has to do with, I wonder if this task applies to elephants. If there's no elephants around, then I can't really show you, how I would do this task with an elephant. So we're also unlimited by the robot's manipulation and gesture capabilities. So a lot of the pool-based active learning assumes kind of discrete state space, and so that's something that we can't really assume with robotics. And we'd like to be able to ask questions in the continuous state action space that the robot is trying to learn in. Okay, so we've been thinking about trying to address this with adapting 3 different kinds of active learning queries to robotics. And so these have never been applied to robotics before, but they are interesting. They have interesting correlations. So the first is label queries. And in a typical learning from demonstration interaction, you get examples of a skill or a task, and they're all kind of positive examples of the skill. And so one question that the robot can pose is to do something that is a perturbation of that model and say, was this correct? And if the answer is yes, I add that to my pool of positive examples. If the answer is no, it's less clear what should happen with negative examples, but it's something that active work is happening on that. The second type of question that we're thinking about is demo queries. Similar to the last one, except here the robot's going to create a new scenario, like a new starting position for the skill or a new configuration of the environment, and say, can you show me an example like this? So basically adding another positive example or another positive demonstration to my set of demonstrations, but creating the scenario in which that demonstration exists. And the last type is a feature query, which is a relatively recent technique in active learning where rather than asking for a label, a class label, you would specifically ask about the relevance of different features in the state to the positive class label. This is really popular in like text mining or text classification, because words and their feature, is such and such word important for classifying this as spam, and that's nice in that domain because the features themselves are verbalizable, and so that makes it a good candidate for doing feature queries. So for robots, we have a really nice opportunity here because the robot can use its embodiment to instantiate features that might be hard to talk about. So I'll show that. Okay, so before jumping in to how we implemented these on the robot, one question we had was how much these kinds of queries that we see in active learning and can see a nice equivalent for in robotics, how much do these actually come up when people are learning from each other in human question asking? So we did a quick study, or a quick experiment about human question asking, because we found in the literature there's a lot about people asking questions in like a classroom environment, but there's very little about people asking questions while learning an embodied task. So we decided to just run the study. And so we made up some abstract tasks that had correlations to like making a sandwich or doing the laundry or scooping coffee beans and pouring them, but they were abstract enough that people wouldn't know what they were. And so like here's the here's demonstrations of scooping and pouring in this abstract space. So people would see these two demonstrations and have to then ask questions about it. So the process was that, okay, is there a question? So the process is that people had watched two demonstration videos of this task, and then they were able, then they had their question session. They could just ask as many questions as they wanted, and the experimenter would wait for a well-posed question and then answer it. And all of this was videoed. And so then when they were done asking questions, they performed 2 executions of the skill. So that was just for us to validate that they had actually learned the task. So we had 12 participants, and we coded all of this video quite painstakingly for question types, question forms, and what kind of actions and embodiment they were doing while they were asking questions. So I'll just summarize the results because it was really pretty interesting. And that first thing that was great news is that of the different question forms, 85% of the questions people asked were closed form questions, and 81% of them were yes/no questions. So this is great news for those of us roboticists that don't do natural language understanding. It was great that all I have to be able to understand is yes/no, so I can pose a question that has a closed form, and that's a very human-like question to pose. We also found that of the 3 questions that I talked about as designing for robots, 82% of the questions that people asked were feature queries. People just get straight down and talk about, is this important? Is this feature important? Is that feature important? You see much less like whole demonstrations of the task where people ask, did I do it right? But we did say when people did do that kind of whole demonstrations of the task and ask, did I do it right? They did a really interesting and smart thing that, that we're going to also implement on the robot. So sometimes, sometimes they would do what you expect, like a whole thing, and they say, was that right? And that's like the canonical label query. But 60% of the label queries were like this. So they break it up and they ask for verification along the way, which is computationally a really smart thing to do, because you don't waste this whole example and call it all negative if only the very end was negative. So that's smart. 60% of the questions that people asked used some form of embodiment. So we saw a lot of like instantiations of features that you were talking about. So picking up an object and moving it in some way to ask about a feature query, or a lot of pointing gestures and deictic gestures to embody the question that you were asking. And yeah.
So they would ask, like the guy asked if I rotated clockwise, is that correct? And what if it didn't matter? The answer has to be yes, right? But
So,
it actually doesn't matter, so they're learning the wrong procedure because they asked a much too specific question.
Yeah. So there was, yeah, so I mean, this is why the coding process was very iterative, but also we pilot tested this a lot because the experimenter, Maya, had to get very, had to come up with a protocol for how to answer the questions. And so, and a lot of times, we just rewatched some of these videos with my other student that's doing more kind of turn-taking, and we realized that what was actually happening a lot of times is that, Maya was getting them to ask a more well-posed question a lot of the times. But for the label queries in particular, when we decided that, when they were asking about, was this particular thing that I did correct, the answer has to be yes, no. But when they get to feature queries, that's when, this doesn't matter, that doesn't matter comes up. So if they would pose it as a feature query, then she would talk about the invariance. But not until they did.
They asked this label query and they asked it about something that didn't matter, they would end up learning the wrong.
Right. Correct. But people asked enough questions that all their executions were correct. So it might be that at some point during the question process they had a wrong model, but it got fixed or something. Yeah. So we don't have a fine-grained, we didn't ask them to do executions during the question process, so we don't know very much about what their mental model was other than the questions they were asking. But yeah, it's true that you can over-represent the invariance. Okay. So the nice thing about using an embodiment to ground questions for robots is that we can take a question like this, where does orientation around X matter, and change it into a question like this. So does this orientation matter? So we use this a lot. So we don't have to have names for all of our features. We just have to use the word this and do them. And so that's really nice and is very natural and easy for people to answer. Okay, so let's just look at how we implement these on the robot. So this is going to be using the same kind of kinesthetic teaching and keyframe-based sequential pose modeling. So here we're learning to pour something from one hand to the other.
Record frame. Recorded. Record frame. Recorded. End of demonstration. I see. New demonstration.
And so in these, we typically started with 2 demonstrations to seed the model and then start with questions after that. And so in this example, you'd get a couple of demonstrations, and so then you have these sequential pose distributions that are more or less varied depending on the demonstrations that you saw. And so to create a label query, you want to perturb what would normally be generated from this pose distribution and say, well, okay, I want to take this distribution at the start and do something different, more different than what it would generate if I just sampled it. And same for some other demonstrations. So we did this for a couple of keyframe clusters in the distribution, and then create a new trajectory and execute this and say, can I do this? And for feature queries, you would take a specific distribution and ask about a particular dimension of it. And so if you pick a dimension that's highly varied, then you might hypothesize that it doesn't matter. And so your question would be, does position matter at the start? But if you pick a different distribution that's tightly, has a tight variance, then you might hypothesize that it has to be this. And so your question would be, do I have to have this rotation at the end? Something like that. So let's see an example where the first 2 demonstrations, which we already saw.
Can I do this? Yes, Simon, you can. Can I do this? No, Simon, you cannot.
So the first one becomes another positive example in my demonstrations, and the second one is a negative example, but it was really just the perturbation that I made to the second distribution cluster that caused that. So my perturbation to the start should still be valid. So that's where the partial label queries help. So here I'm going to ask along the way.
Like this? Yes, Simon, you can. Okay. When I go here, next I come here. Can I finish like this? No, Simon, you can.
So that's where I get to keep the perturbation that I made in the beginning as a positive example, but I don't get to keep the perturbation that I made at the end as a positive example. So then on feature queries,
I start here. Then I move here. At this point, does my hand have to be positioned like this?
so now I'm not only asking about, can I be like this? I'm saying, can my hand be positioned like this, or does the orientation have to be like this?
Does the position matter? No, Simon, it does not.
Okay, so that gives you a nice kind of invariance on the position of the hand at the beginning. Okay, so the last kind of social learning topic I wanted to touch on is the reciprocity, and so that's tightly, very much related to the last part about asking questions, because that's a kind of social interaction, but it's actually directly related to active learning, because one of the reasons we got into this was active learning observations of active learning gone wrong, I guess. So one of the first experiments we did with active learning was about 4 years ago, with people teaching simple tangram puzzle tasks to the robot. They give positive examples or negative examples of some concept, like a snowman or a house, and the robot could ask questions or not after each example. And we noticed that just because the robot asked a question doesn't mean the people answered it. And it often had to do with whether they were already thinking about doing something else, or they were already turning to grab some pieces to get their next example ready. So turn-taking and getting the social dynamics of this back and forth interaction of teaching and learning was really important. And so we can't just assume that people are going to ask our questions. So it sounds obvious, but it was a big kind of aha moment for us. And my student Crystal Chow has been focused on this really cool problem of turn-taking dynamics kind of ever since. So so I want to talk to you about what we're doing with turn-taking dynamics, and then how that fits into the whole social learning robot paradigm. So turn-taking interaction is a phenomenon that arises in bottlenecking resources. So an example is any shared tool or physical space where you have to wait for somebody to be done before you can use it. Or the one that we're usually talking about is the conversational floor, because people don't like to talk over each other, so we have to share this bottlenecked resource. It's multimodal because it's a lot of, you're talking about verbal, gesture, gaze cues, manipulation that is all needing to be coordinated. And turn-taking in humans is a reciprocal process. So we're usually trying to have the sharing of the physical resource or the conversational floor be somewhat balanced. So we're trying to do a balanced give and take, and we're going to take initiative to repair any communication breakdowns. So the result of multimodal reciprocal turn-taking is fluency. So we have the seamless and efficient manner that we adapt to each other's timing in order to achieve our goals. And so our goal is to improve human-robot turn-taking by turn-taking fluency by controlling behavioral time. And so what Crystal's been developing for her PhD is a system called CADENCE, which stands for the Control Architecture for the Dynamics of Embodied Natural Communication and Engagement, which is a mouthful. But so there's a couple of unique design decisions of CADENCE that I want to go through. And so the first is this notion of turn-taking versus context dichotomy. So one of the things we really wanted to get at is that there's something generic to the particular domain or context about turn-taking dynamics. And so people can have, are good at having social interaction across a lot of different contexts with a new person. So there's something about the turn-taking itself and that regulation of floor and handling these bottlenecked resources that's sort of generic that we'd like to take across to different domains. But clearly it's related to the semantic information flow of the context itself. So there's this pairing of a domain model or a state machine that or some way that you expect the state of the domain to unfold, and the way that the turn-taking model can help you regulate the timing of that. So one of the first studies we did was a Wizard of Oz study about people playing Simon Says with the robot, and we saw a couple of different kinds of interaction breakdowns that we were trying to fix with our model. So one was when the robot took too long to finish its turn.
Play the guitar.
Okay. Oh. Okay.
I will.
So in this case, it's very robotic, right? So getting turn-taking wrong means you're acting robotic, which we love. It takes way too long and finishes his animation and declares I win, way after the human has already relinquished their turn and realized that they were wrong. Another example is simultaneous starts. So here.
Sure. Can it be my turn to play Simon? Sure. Yes.
So the human backs off from the simultaneous start, which in general is not a problem, and simultaneous starts happen all the time in conversation, but it shouldn't always be the human's job to back off and do the repair. The robot should realize that there is a problem and say, okay, well, last time you backed off, so this time I'm going to back off, or I have some parameter that I'm tuning to that respect.
Would it be bad if the robot always backed off, being properly respectful of the security of the species?
I think it's a great question, and so I'm going to show that's the first kind of robot we built, and I think that the answer is that that's not the robot that you want. But so CADENCE uses time Petri nets to do this really fine-grained control of actions, so that we can do things. So we can really easily represent something like floor relinquishing. So here's successfully relinquishing the Simon Says. So better than our previous one. It also works in the speech. Sure, deference to the superior species. There you go. Okay, so we did a study of this to quantify kind of the effects that this would have on human-robot interaction. And so the human and the robot collaboratively solved this Towers of Hanoi task. That isn't rings because the robot is good at manipulating these cups, but basically Towers of Hanoi. So it's a two-group study where in the baseline condition, the actions always ran to completion and no relinquishing of the floor, and in the experimental condition where the actions could be interrupted, and we found that floor relinquishing interruptions were they were significantly more task efficiency, people perceived a better balance of control, and people thought the interaction was more fluent. So the baseline, you saw a lot of places where the human's backing off a lot in the baseline. In the experimental condition, so it would interrupt its speech if the person already started to do the thing that it was asking. And it would get out of the way if the person's going towards the peg that it was thinking of going towards. And so it basically worked really well to have this very passive yielding behavior. But I like to show this one example of this extreme participant that really was not very interested in human-robot interaction. This person was very interested in solving the Towers of Hanoi task, and they were just kind of doing this puzzle. No, not yet. Not yet. It's almost time. It's almost time. So what happens is the person gets in, they get stuck. They don't have superior planning capabilities, or they don't have superior solving of towers of Hanoi capabilities. So they get stuck and they stop. And that's the point at which the robot interjects itself and says, okay, now it's my time to be a team player, and I can help us get back on track. And you actually saw this person let the robot do more actions like as this went on, because the robot like swooped in and saved the day. So that was like a big win. Okay, so I want to really quickly show you the next thing that we did after that, and then I'll wrap up. But so that was just yielding, so it's this very passive behavior. And I think that we want the robot to be able to jump in and ask and do things on its own. So one example scenario where you definitely have to seize the floor is asking a question. Another example, you might want to have different kind of parameterizations of your floor regulation depending on what the domain is of your robot. If you have a tour guide robot, that robot has a high status, high power. They should control the floor a lot. They should maybe interrupt people that are, keeping the tour from being on progress, or other things like that. So I think there's ways and reasons that you want the robot to not always be yielding the floor. And so the way that we're tackling this is by having a parameterization on our Petrinet that has like a knob that you can turn on things like floor factors. So what's the balance of how often you're controlling the floor versus me? How much of a tolerance do I want to have for pauses in the conversation or the speech? And do I want to require that there's eye gaze before I seize the floor, and things like that. So these are parameters on a kind of big hairy net, and I'll just skip straight to the experiment. So the experiment we did here is to completely take away the semantics of the domain and have the interaction only be controlled by the turn-taking dynamics. So the robot's interacting with objects in a tabletop, and the person's goal is to talk with the robot about objects as if it's a small child that doesn't understand English. And so different parameter settings would result in different social dynamics. And so we had a very passive parameter setting and a very active parameter setting, and kind of just wanted to see that if this produced different behavior. And we saw that it did result in different floor time, and people perceived the robot to be subjectively different. They thought this passive robot was an introvert, and they thought that this active robot was an extrovert. And it also, what I'm excited about is that it elicited different behavior from the people. So if I defer to you and only give back channel responses, then I can get you to talk more. So as a learner, I might want to have that parameter setting so I get you to talk a lot and tell me about everything. So that's what I'm kind of excited about. So I'll show a couple of examples. I should also mention that the robot uses like gibberish, kismet-like speech. So these videos are kind of funny. But so here's the active robot that seizes the floor a lot. It's kind of weird. So the robot just doesn't let the human have a turn, and the human ends up being just playing a kind of supporting role to the robot's exploration in the process. Whereas in the passive case, the robot takes less initiative and mostly just audits and does a back channel. And so you see that, just wait.
This is ice cream. Ice cream is good. You eat it.
So by not doing as much, the robot's getting the human to tell it about all the objects and be more active participant and take more of the floor. So the robot was perceived as different personalities, and so we can use this turn-taking parameters to kind of tune the knob of what kind of robot is appropriate for the domain that you might have. So where this is all going is that I want to put all this together and have a person that can give task demonstrations, that they could be physical. This is part of a social dialogue. The robot's learning these task concepts in a goal-oriented fashion. And this floor regulation is letting the robot decide when it's appropriate to interrupt for a question. So it might decide, okay, I have a question, but the floor regulation is going to let you time that question. And also decide whether I'm going to ask a question with a back channel response of just kind of saying, huh, or ask a full-blown question. So that is, a lot of this stuff is published, and so I can point you to papers, and I'm happy to take other questions or talk afterwards.
Any questions?
I hear we have time. Matt.
I might be asking questions that are kind of not perfectly aligned with the goals of the main thrust of the research, but I can't help worrying about applications. Like when I think about the end user teaching a robot something, I think, I don't want a robot to show up at my door and I have to teach it how to pour, right?
Right.
I might want to teach it like where the bowls go and stuff like
Yeah.
that. And then when I look at pouring, I think that this very kinematic way of thinking about pouring probably isn't going to have the best results.
Right.
That you want something that's somehow more appreciative of fluids and the rate at which something's leaving, and sand might behave different than water. I don't know.
Right. So then,
it seems like this is a little bit tangential to the main thrust.
yeah, I think that's, I think the part of this that gets at that is the, deriving the correct features for the domain from a low-level set. Like if I don't have a feature space that's going to let me see something different about sand versus water, then I can't build that concept of thinking that, sand, how I handle sand has to be different than how I handle water. So, that's why I really think that this notion of only doing things in the low-level skill space is, I agree. It's not going to be it's not going to be the end thing that we're doing. I really like thinking about it in terms of either both of those, both the high-level skill and the low-level skill working together, or just learning the high-level skills and that's it, and have that be constraints to a planner that then gets to figure out how to do it however you want. And one of the reasons that we are thinking about the low-level skill space is the connection to the learning from demonstration work. So that's kind of a how we talk to some of the skill learning work that's happening. That's how we kind of make this relevant to that whole domain. So there's a little bit of that. So I have mixed feelings about the skill learning. Like I think there's ways to improve what's happening and make it more, change the interface and make it more usable. But I also have this. I agree with you that people are probably going to want to just talk about goals, like where do the bowls go.
Does the human get any feedback when the robot becomes different? Does it say, you go ahead, or does it just stop talking?
When the robot's deferent?
Yeah.
So the deference is that the robot backs away. So there's the body pose, there's the arm just pulling away from the workspace, and the robot would take less speaking turns and do more just
Okay,
like
okay.
back
But
channel.
once it becomes deferred, like auditorily, just stops talking altogether?
No, there's still a back channel
Okay.
response. So it's still engaged,
Okay.
but it's less likely to take a full turn because it has this parameter that it's trying to keep at a certain level of you holding the floor twice as long as me.
Okay.
So that's like one of the deferent settings. So if I'm maintaining this amount of floor time, it's never going to be a good idea for me to take a really long turn.
Okay.
Yeah.
So how much domain knowledge is needed for research?
So the main domain knowledge, so I guess it depends on which project you're talking about. The main thing that we're,
Especially interested in the conversation
Yeah, so the main thing that we would call domain knowledge in the learning is, the feature space. Like, what's the feature space that I'm giving, and what can I see about the objects? What kind of, what's the resolution of size or color or location, and that's the main kind of domain constraint that you're going to have on. But otherwise, aside from the state space, there's no domain knowledge that's given to the learning process. Mm-hmm.
So, going along with that, I mean, there was something I noticed in the video that struck me as very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
The demonstrations that they gave in clearing the table had them picking up the bowl, dumping it in the garbage, putting it back.
Mm-hmm.
And then when they actually did the task, didn't bother putting it back down. So it seems to be there must be some kind of knowledge that said putting it back is not important in that task. Because I can imagine a task in which that was the key thing to do.
Yeah.
So how did it know that you had to put it back?
So and let me see if I can remember exactly what happened. But so those tasks are very object-based. So it's like, I want to pick out objects that don't meet the criteria, like this dirty bowl, and I want to do actions on it until it meets the expectations. And so that's the point at which then it becomes I need to both put this stuff in the trash and then put it in the sink, because the final goal is for this dirty bowl to be in the sink.
But how did it know that intermediate state
wasn't important? I would have to go back and remember, but I think that it is so we had the goal of the intermediate state, but then in the end, it must have been that we added that structure to. So part of what you can be learning also is the partial order of these subtasks. And so we can add, we must have, I think that was hand coded though, because we did not do any learning of the partial structure of that. So I think that we must have had to add that in, the sequencing. Mm-hmm.
This might be down the road. There's an accumulation of knowledges that happen on the robots. And at some point, there's going to be a demonstration by a human and the robot says, I don't think that's the way you guys should do that. And so maybe you can speculate, how far we are away from
Yeah, we're not doing that yet. I'm really interested in this problem because then, so it's, backing off from even that, it's hard, it's a hard question to say, what do I do with demonstrations from multiple teachers? And how do I combine what multiple people are telling me into a single model or two different models or three different models? So I think that's an interesting problem that gets at this sort of generating long-term huge knowledge bases of tasks.
I think it was the very first where a lot of the learning seemed to be, or the demonstration was to one robot, but then Simon came in and did it? Or
yeah, so we did.
Was there a transference from one robot to the other?
Yeah, so in that case, the perceptual space was the same. So it was locations and size of object and color variance. And it was all about the perceptual space of the tasks. And so that makes it very easy to transfer from one robot to the other. So we actually did all the work on Simon and then went out to Honda for a week and did the ASIMO stuff. Yeah.
You talked about hard coding, kind of hard coded social norms. Have you considered or done anything with having the robot learn social norms from watching two humans learn a task? Yeah,
so we haven't done anything explicitly about learning social norms. We have in that Simon Says experiment, one of the things that we were looking at there is, so we were interested in this notion of when people decide to take their turn, and so that we could try to model when the robot should try to jump in and take its turn. And one thing in HRI that people like to point to is like, oh well, eye gaze is this cue that you should pay attention to about when, how to pass the turnaround or the conversational floor. But really, people were completely focused on the information. Semantic information of the day. So as soon as I had all the information, as soon as I have all the information to take my turn, I will take it. As soon as you say, Simon, play air guitar, and you start doing this, as soon as I hear Simon play, I'm going to start doing it because I have all the information, semantic information to take my turn. But that's the closest thing we've done to try to modeling from data some social norms so far. Yeah.
One last question, and the rest of you can bother her after we release everybody else.
Anka, for the last question.
How does Simon move his head? How do you decide? How does Simon decide
where to move the head?
I thought it also had eyes. So
Yeah. So in the turn-taking stuff, it's moving it has like a saliency calculation, and it will look at people's faces, people's hands, or the objects on the scene. And there's a saliency calculation based on some object movement and some habituation. But especially in the active case, it gets a little erratic sometimes. But most of the time in the learning interactions, it's looking at the teacher, and then when it goes to demonstrate the task, it'll be looking at its own hand.
Okay.